Top 10 Deadliest Epidemics in History. 1. Hamin Mangha, 3000 BCE. About 5,000 years ago, an epidemic wiped out a prehistoric village in China. In Inner Mongolia between 2011 and 2015, multiple archaeological excavations on a particular Neolithic site led to a remarkable discovery: the presence of a small prehistoric village that held only 29 houses, where the archaeologists found 100 charred skeletons stuffed inside a 200 square feet hut. The archaeological site is now called Hamin Mangha and is one of the best preserved prehistoric sites in northeastern China. Archaeological and anthropological study indicates that the epidemic happened quickly enough that there was no time for proper burials, and the site was not inhabited again. Before the discovery of Hamin Mangha, another prehistoric mass burial that dates to roughly the same time period was found at a site called Miaozigu, in northeastern China. Together, these discoveries suggest that an epidemic ravaged the entire region. 2. Plague of Athens, 430 BC. The Athenian plague occurred in 430 to 26 BCE at the time of the Peloponnesian War, which was fought between Athens and Sparta. This epidemic was documented by Thucydides, a plague survivor, who gave detailed descriptions of the plague in his History of the Peloponnesian War. It ravaged the people of Athens and lasted for 5 years. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 100,000 people. The plague originated in Ethiopia and quickly spread to Egypt and Greece. The early symptoms were headaches, conjunctivitis, rashes, fetid breath, and fever, followed by coughing up blood, painful stomach cramps, vomiting, and ineffectual retching as the disease advanced in its victims. Thucydides wrote that people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head, and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. An infected person would be dead in most cases by the 7th-8th day, while those that somehow survived suffered from permanent amnesia, partial paralysis, or blindness. The frontline caregivers, such as doctors and nurses, were affected the most and would often die as they tried healing the patients. What exactly this epidemic was has long been a source of debate among scientists. A number of diseases have been put forward as possibilities, including typhoid fever and Ebola. Many scholars believe that overcrowding caused by the war exacerbated the epidemic. Despite the epidemic, the war continued on, not ending until 404 BC, when Athens was forced to capitulate to Sparta. 3. Antonine Plague, AD 165 to 180. Recorded by a physician named Galen, this plague is also known as the Plague of Galen, and is believed to have been an epidemic of smallpox. It was carried into the Roman Empire by soldiers coming back from Seleucia. It spread rapidly over the closely knit Roman Empire, affecting a large geographical area which included Egypt, Asia Minor, Italy, and Greece. The plague killed almost 1/3 of the population in many parts of the empire, finished off the Roman army, and killed Marcus Aurelius. This epidemic had a severe impact on the Roman Empire by weakening its economic and army supremacy. This pandemic is believed to have created the conditions that set in motion the fall of the great Roman Empire. The Roman historian Dio Cassius estimated 2,000 deaths per day in Rome at the height of the outbreak. In the second outbreak, the estimate of the rate of death was much higher, upwards of 5,000 per day. All told, it has been suggested that 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire population perished, estimated at 60 to 70 million throughout the empire. 4. The Black Death. The Black Death, or simply the plague, was a pandemic of unprecedented scale caused by the bubonic plague that originated in China in 1334, which spread through Central Asia, entered northern India, and finally arrived in Europe in 1347, through the famous Silk Trade route. Within 5 years, the plague conquered almost the entire European continent, further spreading into Russia and the Middle East. While its impact was severe from 1343 to 1356, it continued in a milder form well into the 1400s, and reduced the global population from 450 million to below 300 million. According to historians, Black Death killed 60% of the European population at that time. Some estimates suggest that it wiped out over half of Europe's population. It was caused by a strain of the bacterium Yersinia pestis that is likely extinct today and was spread by fleas on infected rodents. The bodies of victims were buried in mass graves. Besides the terrifying nature of the disease and its refusal to die down, The epidemic also had some negative impacts on the mental health of the common people. With a rising sense of religiousness, again the Christian interpretation used during the Justinian Plague era, which promoted the disease as a punishment for sins, was set rolling, which brought in the concept of heretics, leading to the infamous witch hunting that caused the violent deaths of many women, non-Catholics, and Jews. Besides changing the socio-political and religious courses in Europe, the Black Death also created a new social group, which is now known as the middle class. The plague changed the course of Europe's history. With so many dead, labor became harder to find, bringing about better pay for workers and the end of Europe's system of serfdom. Studies suggest that surviving workers had better access to meat and higher quality bread. The lack of cheap labor may also have contributed to technological innovation. 5. Plague of Cyprian, AD 250 to 271. The Plague of Cyprian erupted in Ethiopia around Easter of 250 CE. It reached Rome in the following year, eventually spreading to Greece and further east to Syria. The plague lasted nearly 20 years and, at its height, reportedly killed as many as 5,000 people per day in Rome. In 2014, archaeologists in Luxor found what appears to be a mass burial site of plague victims. Their bodies were covered with a thick layer of lime, historically used as a disinfectant. Archaeologists found 3 kilns used to manufacture lime and the remains of plague victims burned in a giant bonfire. Sufferers experienced bouts of diarrhea, continuous vomiting, fever, deafness, blindness, paralysis of their legs and feet, swollen throats, and blood filled their eyes, conjunctival bleeding, while staining their mouths. More often than not, death resulted. Experts aren't sure what disease caused the epidemic. The bowels, relaxed into a constant flux, discharge the bodily strength, and a fire originated in the marrow ferments into wounds of the fauces, an area of the mouth. Cyprian wrote in Latin in a work called De Mortalite. The disease episode of the mid-200s CE caused political, military, economic, and religious upheaval. In addition to the thousands of people dying per day in Rome and in the immediate vicinity, the outbreak claimed the lives of 2 emperors, Justinian in 251 CE and Claudius II Gothicus in 270 CE. The period in between the emperors witnessed political instability as rivals struggled to claim and hold the throne. The lack of leadership and the depletion of soldiers from the ranks of the Roman legions contributed to the deteriorating condition of the empire by weakening Rome's ability to fend off external attacks. 6. Plague of Justinian, AD 541 to 542. The plague is named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, reigned AD 527 to 565. Under his reign, the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest extent, controlling territory that stretched from the Middle East to Western Europe. Justinian constructed a great cathedral known as Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, the empire's capital. The Byzantine Empire was ravaged by the bubonic plague, which marked the start of its decline. The plague reoccurred periodically afterward. Some estimates suggest that up to 10% of the world's population died. The plague arrived in Constantinople in 542 CE, almost a year after the disease first made its appearance in the outer provinces of the empire. The outbreak continued to sweep throughout the Mediterranean world for another 225 years, finally disappearing in 750 CE. Originating in China and northeast India, the plague was carried to the Great Lakes region of Africa via overland and sea trade route. Procopius, in his Secret History, describes victims as suffering from delusions, nightmares, fevers and swellings in the groin, armpits, and behind their ears. Procopius recounts that, while some sufferers lapsed into comas, others became highly delusional. Many victims suffered for days before death, while others died almost immediately after the onset of symptoms. The plague was so widespread that no one was safe. Even the emperor caught the disease, though he did not die. Dead bodies littered the streets of the capital. Justinian ordered troops to assist in the disposal of the dead. Once the graveyards and tombs were filled, burial pits and trenches were dug to handle the overflow. War and trade facilitated the spread of the disease throughout the Byzantine Empire. Justinian spent the early years of his reign defeating a variety of enemies, battling Ostrogoths for control over Italy, fighting Vandals and Berbers for control in North Africa, and fending off Franks, Slavs, Avars, and other barbarian tribes engaged in raids against the empire. 7. Spanish flu pandemic 1918 to 1920. The Spanish flu pandemic, which took place in the middle of World War I, was the first pandemic that took place in the arena of modern medicine, yet had devastating effects across the world. It was caused by the H1N1 strain of the influenza virus, and despite the later advancement in epidemiology and public health, the true origin of Spanish flu still remains unknown, and among the possible sites of origin listed are the USA, China, Spain, France, and Austria. The deadly H1N1 strain of influenza virus rapidly spread to all parts of the world, and besides severely affecting Europe where large-scale military movements and large crowds helped in its spread, this pandemic affected Africa, Asia, USA, and the Pacific Islands. It infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide, about one-third of the planet's population, and killed an estimated 20 million to 50 million victims, including some 675,000 Americans. At the time, there were no effective drugs or vaccines to treat this killer flu strain. Citizens were ordered to wear masks, schools, theaters and businesses were shuttered and bodies piled up in makeshift morgues before the virus ended its deadly global march. Influenza, or flu, is a virus that attacks the respiratory system. The flu virus is highly contagious. When an infected person coughs, sneezes or talks, respiratory droplets are generated and transmitted into the air, and can be inhaled by anyone nearby. Additionally, a person who touches something with the virus on it and then touches his or her mouth, eyes or nose can become infected. Scientists still do not know for sure where the Spanish flu originated, though theories point to France, China, Britain, or the United States, where the first known case was reported at Camp Funston in Fort Riley, Kansas, on March 11, 1918. By the summer of 1919, the flu pandemic came to an end, as those that were infected either died or developed immunity. Almost 90 years later, in 2008, researchers announced they discovered what made the 1918 flu so deadly. A group of 3 genes enabled the virus to weaken a victim's bronchial tubes and lungs and clear the way for bacterial pneumonia. 8. Cocoliztli epidemic, 1545 to 1548. The infection that caused the Cocoliztli epidemic was a form of viral hemorrhagic fever that killed 15 million inhabitants of Mexico and Central America. Among a population already weakened by extreme drought, the disease proved to be utterly catastrophic. Cocoliztli is the Aztec word for pest. The symptoms were unlike anything the doctors of the time had seen. Victims turned yellow from jaundice, and blood ran from their ears and noses. They had hallucinations, agonizing convulsions. They died in days. The Cocoliztli appeared from almost nowhere. Nobody knew what it was, says Rodolfo Acuna Soto, a historical epidemiologist at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico. Even today, nobody knows what exactly was responsible for the epidemic, which first appeared in Mexico, then called New Spain, in the 16th century and killed an estimated 45% of the entire native population. Historical records suggest it was some type of hemorrhagic fever like Ebola, but DNA evidence published this week suggests the culprit might have been Salmonella, a common foodborne illness. The evidence was tucked in the teeth of 29 skeletons unearthed from the ruins of an ancient city archaeologists called Tepozcalula Yucunta in the Oaxaca region of Mexico. The main inhabitants were Mixtec people, a distinct group from the Aztecs of central Mexico. Severe abdominal and chest pain, head and neck nodules, neurologic disorders, jaundice, and profuse bleeding from the nose, eyes, and mouth. Death frequently occurred within 3 to 4 days. Beyond the estimations done by Motolinea and others for New Spain, most of the death toll figures cited for the outbreak of 1545 to 1548 are concerned with Aztec populations. Around 800,000 died in the Valley of Mexico, which led to the widespread abandonment of many indigenous sites in the area during, or shortly after this 4-year period. 9. Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666. This was the worst outbreak of plague in England since the Black Death of 1348. London lost roughly 15% of its population. While 68,596 deaths were recorded in the city, the true number was probably over 100,000. Other parts of the country also suffered. The plague started in April 1665 and spread rapidly through the hot summer months. The death rate began to rise during the hot summer months and peaked in September when 7,165 Londoners died in 1 week. Rats carried the fleas that caused the plague. They were attracted by city streets filled with rubbish and waste, especially in the poorest areas. Fleas from plague-infected rodents were one of the main causes of transmission. By the time the plague ended, about 100,000 people, including 15% of the population of London, had died. Those who could, including most doctors, lawyers and merchants, fled the city. Charles II and his courtiers left in July for Hampton Court and then Oxford. Most of the sick in 1665 to 1666 had bubonic plague. This created swellings, buboes, in the lymph nodes found in the armpits, groin and neck. Plague sufferers experienced headaches, vomiting and fever. They had a 30% chance of dying within 2 weeks. This type of plague spread from a bite caused by a black rat flea that carried the Yersinia pestis bacteria. After peaking in September 1665, the city's plague deaths began to taper off that winter. In February 1666, King Charles II returned to London, signaling a belief that the city had become reasonably safe, says Christoph Hale, the chair of British Literature and Culture at the University of Duisburg-Essen, Germany, who has written about the Great Fire. But this was not the end of that city's suffering. On September 2, 1666, the Great Fire of London started, lasting for 4 days and burning down a large portion of the city. 10. HIV/AIDS pandemic, 1981 to present. AIDS has claimed an estimated 35 million lives since it was first identified. HIV, which is the virus that causes AIDS, likely developed from a chimpanzee virus that transferred to humans in West Africa in the 1920s. The virus made its way around the world, and AIDS was a pandemic by the late 20th century. Now, about 64% of the estimated 40 million living with human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, live in sub-Saharan Africa. For decades, the disease had no known cure, but medication developed in the 1990s now allows people with the disease to experience a normal lifespan with regular treatment. Even more encouraging, 2 people have been cured of HIV as of early 2020. Since its clinical discovery in 1981, HIV/AIDS has killed around 865,000 people on average each year. Today in the United States there are about 1.1 million people living with HIV/AIDS, and an estimated 38,000 new infections occur every year. In 2018, 17,032 people were in the last stage of the virus where the body's immune system is badly damaged.